vulnerability and risk assessment. So go ahead and log into Socrative, Portal TSTC. We're going to talk about how we conduct risk assessments, our different options for risk, and then how we would assess that, the different kind of tools we would use, what each tool does and how it works a little bit. So risk is the possibility of some kind of malicious attack occurring in the cybersecurity world, I should say. So that might cause damage, it might cause downtime. Downtime is our mortal enemy because it means we can't be productive. If we can't be productive, we can't make money. So that's the mortal enemy of all IT people. Risk management is trying to identify what our risks are, assess them, prioritize them, and then try to figure out what's the best way to mitigate risk. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So normally you've got a few different ways that you would handle risk. So the first one is transfer the risk to another organization or a third party, also known as outsource it. Okay? If I have a Microsoft Exchange server, I know in my business it's running on my email, I know it's getting old, I know it's starting to have some errors, it needs to be replaced soon, I could just sign up for Google Apps and move all the mailboxes to that. So I'm outsourcing my risk to Google, and in the end saving myself a whole bunch of money, right? Some people don't want to outsource, some people want to control everything, and that's up to them and the budgetary needs and restraints of the business. You could avoid the risk altogether, so you just don't carry out whatever plan that risk would give you. So the risk outweighs the benefit, so we're just not going to do that thing. If you were trying to set up some kind of account portal so your customers could log into it, but in doing that, you're going to open yourself up for attacks against your database. You would say, well, that's a really great idea, I'd like to do it now, but right now we don't really have the money to take care of that, so we're going to back burner it. We could reduce our risk, so we could install a firewall, install an antivirus, install something that's going to help reduce risk overall in the organization. Or we could just accept it. We could just say, well, maybe we don't have the budget to fix that problem, so we're just going to have to accept some risks and hope for the best. So if we don't have a budget for an intrusion prevention system, we'll just set up a firewall and kind of keep our eye on it, right? We accept the risk that we might be attacked, and we'll just try to do the best we can. Residual risk is the risk that's left over after you have your security in place, you have a disaster recovery plan in place, everything's been implemented. There's no way that you're ever going to be able to get rid of all risk, right? There's always going to be something, there's going to be a new kind of attack, a new vulnerability you're not aware of. So you can't ever get rid of risk, there will always be it. You can't foresee and you can't prepare for every threat that might come at you. So our risk assessment is trying to determine the threats, the hazards that could occur in a given amount of time to our network and to the individual computers on our network. So we're going to kind of follow an order here to figure this out. So let's say, and I've had this happen to me before, I have a company that's a customer that has really, really old software that they commissioned to be built like 15 or 20 years ago. At that point, the operating system at the time that was active was Windows XP. So this computer runs Windows XP, which is now defunct, right? They're moving away from it. You can't get support for it anymore for just a normal business customer. There's specialized parts of the market where they do still support it, from what I've heard. So I have this really expensive piece of software. Software costs $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, right? I have it on a 15-year-old computer running Windows XP. And that computer produces whatever the thing is that runs all the production for the entire place. Happens all the time, okay? So this, and you can see it's disgusting, especially in machine shops. Machine shops, there's dust and dirt everywhere. It's not uncommon to open up a computer and look like And that's one of those old, like, gray and purple looking Dells that is kind of the Nokia of computers. Like, you could beat it with a baseball bat and kick it and throw it out a 2-story window and it'd probably still go up, right?
Apparently you have 6 pounds worth of dirt in it and it still work too.
Apparently so. I've seen several like this. So let's say that happened. That's our scenario. So first we got to figure out what our assets are. So in this case, our assets are the computer, which really isn't worth all that much, except the fact that it has XP and XP is hard to get. What's our other asset?
What was that again?
What's the other asset in this case that I'm trying to protect?
The data on it.
Okay, something else on the computer. That software I spent $15,000 on 15 years ago. That's an asset, right?
Oh,
That's an asset. So then we think about, okay, what are the vulnerabilities that have to do with this? So if my computer dies, my production stops working for my business, which means I don't make money, which means I lose money. So that's a really big deal. So something needs to be done with that, right? And you can't get these computers anymore. They're out of service. Maybe there was a flaw in them at some point, so they don't sell them anymore. You can't get them. It's just too bad. Then we think about threats and the likelihood of a threat. So since this is a Windows XP computer, and they're no longer supporting updates or giving out like malicious software tools for it, there is an enhanced chance of viruses, right? If this computer is hooked up to the network. If it's not, okay, maybe we do that. Maybe we can't do that. Maybe this has to connect to a database somewhere else, and it's got to do that to work, so it has to be on the network. So now we have an XP computer on the network that's out of date, and the likelihood of threats are pretty high. So then we look at the potential monetary impact, because in business it always comes back to dollars, right? So if this ancient machine breaks and production stops, how much money per hour does it cost to get me fixed? So that's just not the computer tech, right, that comes in to fix it. Let's say they do have the part. Let's say it's a fan, and it's something that, you know, okay, it's a CPU fan, it overheated, it shut down, it didn't damage anything, thank goodness. We can install another heat sink that we've got somewhere, kept for many years, I'm sure, and get the thing up and running again. And let's say by the time we get all that done, it takes 3 hours. So if your computer tech charges $75, $80 an hour, okay, you're out that. But how much money did you lose because you weren't making things in that amount of time? It could be thousands of dollars an hour.
I mean, especially if it's on a part of some type of mass production
Yes.
scale. I mean, if you're making $1,000 an hour,
Yeah.
it costs you X amount of dollars to do that. That's
Absolutely. Absolutely.
$10,000.
You would lose a lot. So what if it can't be fixed? I have to scrounge up some kind of XP computer from somewhere else, hope that I have the software disks and I have the licensing that I need to install it. Where's the database? Is that on the computer too? Do I need to go about trying to retrieve that data? And that could be a nightmare. You'd be down for days, right? Would I have to go get new software built really, really quickly, which would cost me tons of money. Tons and tons of money. To be like, hey company, here's these 15-year-old software for this company that's now gone out of business. I need you to rewrite it and make it work for Windows, 7, 8, and 10. That would be really, really expensive, right? Could I use something else in the meantime? Could I scrounge up another computer? Things like that. So just in that one scenario, there's lots of different things to think about. When we assess risk, we can do it in 2 different ways. We can do it qualitative. So we can say, hey, here's the list of all the things that might go wrong. On a scale of 1 to 100, how important are they to us? Whereas, let's say I have this one computer that an administrative assistant uses. She uses it every day, all day. But her job doesn't actually make me money, quote unquote, right? So I don't care so much if that breaks. I can just run down to Best Buy and get her another one. Hook it back up, put her email on it, and she's back in a couple hours. That's not a big deal. The server or the computer that we just saw coated in dirt, those are way higher up on the scale than that. So we can kind of have a qualitative assessment in that way. Whereas a quantitative assessment is the quantity of dollars. So that's what is our monetary value that we would lose, and then how can we go about not losing money, right? So we're trying to get some kind of expected yearly loss in dollars for a risk. So you see some acronyms here. SLE is single loss expectancy. So that's saying, hey, every time this thing goes offline, it's going to cost me this amount of money. Every time this thing breaks, it's going to cost me this amount of money. The ARO is the annualized rate of occurrence. So how many times per year does that thing go down or that thing break? You multiply those together and you get the annualized loss expectancy. What do I expect to lose every year from this thing breaking? So, for an example, if I figure out that I'll lose, now I should tell you that normally you have some kind of third party like statistician or accountant or something come in to get these numbers. You don't just be like, I think it's this. So there's probably some third party involved that will help with this. But if I decide that I have a web server, and I lose $110,250 a year when that web server goes down. So every time it goes down, it costs me $15,750. That happens about 7 times a year, and I end up getting that number, right? That's a pretty significant amount of money. So I can look at that, and from that I can learn, okay, well if I've got this web server, then what's the thing that's making it go down? A lot of the time it's internet connection. So maybe do I need to increase my availability of my web server to make this number go down because the occurrence is less. So now if it only goes down twice a year, well now I'm only losing like 30 grand. So I still have a little bit of risk that it's going to go down, but because I've spent money in the infrastructure to increase the availability, now I have mitigated some of the risk.
So where would those numbers come from? Like how would you go about getting it goes down, it costs me X amount of dollars every time it goes down.
I guess we
It goes
just
down.
judge
I
on
mean-
like what you normally make with it up.
Yeah, I mean that was my question.
Exactly.
Like, is it just from
So if it goes offline 7 times a year, and it goes offline for 8 hours, and I make $15,000 divided by 8 every hour,
yeah?
that kind of thing.
Okay. Because I was wondering if it was like something that you, like especially a third party, they compared it to other instances of the same.
They might go
Like a web
look in
server,
your bookkeeping
like
and
if-
try to figure out.
If your web server's been out for 2 years and it's went out twice, well, this company over here, they have the same type of web server and theirs went out 6 times, and then they do some type of comparison related to.
I don't know if they do that. I mean, it seems perfectly reasonable. That might be a job for like a business consultant kind of thing.
I would
They'll
think
come
so.
in.
Yeah.
Some of the ways that we can analyze the security in our network. So we can have active analysis. So there's actual hands-on tests that are being run on the system. The problem with active testing is you may have to actually take the device offline, which is going to interrupt the flow of communications on your network. Before you do any kind of active testing, you want to back the data up first. This does take up network resources. So if the network needs to be up 100% of the time, because you lose money, if it's not, active testing is probably not going to be something you're going to want to do unless you go completely down for maintenance once a month. We'll do our testing during that point. So when you're trying to scan the network and things like that, it's taking up a whole bunch of bandwidth and speed, and it might be inconveniencing the people that are using the network. So those are some things to think about. It's kind of intrusive testing.
Kind of what Blizzard has done that for 10 years, and every Tuesday, they'll go down for like 7 hours while
Wow.
they do their.
That's a lot.
I mean, they do it from like, I think from like 3 in the morning to like noon.
Yeah.
So like, it's not in like the prime time, but
Yeah.
they've done that every single Tuesday as long as I can
It's
possibly.
good though, that means they're keeping on top of their stuff.
Ubisoft did that the last time when Ubisoft was running their Rainbow Six Beta they were doing. They did it once every other day for like 3.5 hours a day. To make sure things were there.
The passive analysis doesn't have anything to do with the hardware. Nothing is affected. It's just gonna scan some things and pull reports back. Of course, you're probably not gonna get as much information because it's not intrusive. But if you've got a network that still needs to be up and you need to do some kind of recon because an attack happened, you might use some kind of passive analysis. I was not familiar with the term fingerprinting in this way until I read this book. So a hacker's going to scan hosts and try to figure out the ports that are open. What the attackers want to do is figure out the operating system of the computer, because once they figure that out, it's going to narrow down the kind and type of attacks that they can do to a little smaller scope, so then they can actually start attacking. So it's kind of like giving a robber the address to your house, but not the keys to get in. So now they know where the house is, but they don't have a way to get in. They're going to have to figure that out themselves. So this doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get hacked if someone finds out the operating system you're using. They should just kind of narrow things down. Maybe they've got some pre-written scripts for Windows Vista, and then they find out you've got Vista, so they try those scripts. So that's what fingerprinting means in terms of security. That's kind of interesting. There's some different kind of security controls to go over.
A good place to start the conversation about risk is with control types. The National Institute of Standards and Technology is a federal organization in the United States that comes up with standards that are used not only for the federal government, but also nationally and even worldwide. They have a set of standards called the NIST Special Publication 800-53, and that is a publication called the Recommended Security Controls for Federal Information Systems. And although the name says Federal Information Systems, there's some nice information in here that you could almost apply to anybody's organization. If you go out to Google and you search for NIST Special Publication 853, you will see this. This is the document itself. It is quite comprehensive, and it's a very nice overview and a guide to how you can start taking different parts of your organization, the different kinds of risks that you have, and categorizing them, and then setting some standards on how you can deal with risk associated with those different parts of your organization. Inside of this document are what they call 3 classes and 18 different families that are categorized in these 3 classes. The first class is one called technical control types. So you can think of this as things like access control, how you authenticate onto the different resources that are on your network or on your computer, how do you protect your systems, how you protect your communications. All of those technical aspects of control are related in that particular technical class. The second class is the management class. This is a class that talks about how you manage these different aspects of risk in your environment. Things like how you do security assessments, how you provide authorization to different resources in your network or in your environment, how you do planning, how you do risk assessment. Those are extremely important things when you're dealing with security. Security isn't just configuring a firewall properly, it's also setting the proper policies and procedures to follow so that the firewall can be configured properly. The last class is an operational class. What do you do ongoing with the operation to maintain the security in your environment? What do you do when an incident occurs? What are the proper processes to go through? How do you handle changes in configurations inside of your network? You don't want to create security issues related to changes. You don't want people making changes without authorization. How do you protect things physically? Do you lock doors? Do you have key cards? How do you lock down a laptop computer that's very mobile? So all of that's in more of the operational mode of things. And so all three of these classes all work together. You really can't look at just one of them. You have to take into account your technical controls, your management controls, and the operational controls as well. Here's a chart that really does summarize these classes, families, and what they call identifiers for each one of these. It would not be a federal document if we didn't in some way have a list of abbreviations associated with these. For the purposes of the Security Plus exam, you don't have to remember all the identifiers, but it's useful to know these different classes, the technical, the operational, the management, and have an understanding of why these different families are associated with these classes. And if you start looking at them, they make a lot of sense. Technical, yep, that's access control. That's configuring firewalls and making sure your access control lists are set properly. Operationally, you want to have awareness and training. So make sure you're aware of what some of these different families are in these different classes. Get an understanding of what these control types are. And if you have time, read through the document. It's really a very nice overview, quite comprehensive, in fact, of all of these different families and classes and how our federal government uses these classes to control and manage their security, to probably take some of the things they're doing and use in your environment as well.
Some of the ways we classify those controls: preventative, try to prevent something; detective, use during the event to figure out if something has happened; and then corrective controls, try to limit the extent of any damage that has happened from a malicious attack, and then try to recover from it. Okay, vulnerability management. So we're going to try to find the vulnerabilities in our computers and in our networks so that we can fix them. How else will we know what's there unless we scan for it and try to come up with some kind of report to give us that kind of information? We can't just sit around and wait on something to break and then go, oops, I guess we'll fix it, right? So we break that down into 5 different steps, lots of steps in this chapter. So what's the wanted state of our security? So at first glance, you might think, well, I just want everything to be secure all the time, nothing happened, but we know that's not really realistic. There's always going to be a new mousetrap or something. So this can be predefined, like it comes from the managerial part of the business, it can come from the IT part of the business, or maybe you don't have any wanted state of security and you have to make something up. Maybe your wanted state of security is that you only have this number of malicious attacks in such and such time frame. Maybe you have to predefine that because, or define it because no one has it predefined for you. Then you want to create baselines. They like to talk about baselines a lot in security. So basically we analyze and we try to figure out, okay, here's where we want to get, how far away are we from that? And that kind of helps us know how to prioritize our vulnerabilities. So the order in which you want to fix it. So generally the things that are going to cost you the most money or the most downtime are the ones you're most concerned about. And then mitigate them, which just means get rid of them. Get rid of as many of them as possible. If maybe you're using this old software on this one machine and you can upgrade that and get rid of that old machine because that machine is a vulnerability, and it's not going to take that much time or cost you that much money, that might be something you want to do. You're mitigating the risk of using this machine that has whatever wrong with it. And then monitor the environment. So compare against that baseline. Okay, where have we improved and what else can we do? Because security is this ongoing process. Penetration testing is active. So we evaluate the security system with it by essentially simulating an attack on it and then seeing what the response is that comes back after the attack. So there's a manual that's open source that kind of gives some pointers on that, but you don't need to remember that for the test. You can use penetration testing in cooperation with the NIST standards. They do have standards written for that. There is a language. So let's say you've got this information about vulnerability scanning and the information that you've gotten from it. You can kind of contribute this to this large database that you can get online. And that will assist the companies that have to do with whatever the product is or whatever the device is in finding patches. So if you found, you ran vulnerability testing and you found this new Cisco router you had, it's got a vulnerability in it, you put it against that oval database and then Cisco might find it ideally. and fix whatever the problem is and then release an update to the firmware. Some of the tools that we would use. We might do this later on in class. I was trying to do it this week, but that'd just be too much for y'all to do and you'd never get it all done. Study a network map. So you can have the physical and logical connectivity of the network. So essentially this is a thing, it's a piece of software you would install. You tell it, hey, check within this range, check within this subnet, anything like that. There's many different ways that you can do it. And it will kind of process and it will start trying to ping and talk to different kinds of devices. When it gets done, it'll give you an overall map of how everything's connected. With the IP addresses, you can click on them and get the MAC address and how does it get its IP address and all kinds of configuration information from it. And it can be really helpful and really interesting. If you are going into a place where you don't know what the network looks like, you might run one of those just to kind of have something to take back with you and say, okay, what am I looking at? What are all the devices? What's available? Those can be really, really helpful. The one that I was playing with the other day is called Network Topology Mapper. So it's the one that will go out and automatically look. It's really expensive though. I was using this eval copy. It's very expensive. Another option, which is, fairly inexpensive, is Visio. Visio makes some, the Microsoft product, makes some pretty nice looking maps that you can enter configuration information to and make it look really nice. So vulnerability scanning, which is what we're going to do on Thursday, is identifying the threats on the network but not exploiting them. It's just finding the vulnerability. It's not actually trying to attack anything. Nessus, GFI LandGuard, we did this already with Nmap. When we attacked each other's computers, we picked out a target and then we saw what ports were open. That is vulnerability scanning. Now it's not quite what we're doing on Thursday is way more. It's going to give you pages and pages and pages of information about what it finds on the network, but that is a very small part of vulnerability scanning. And then network sniffing, which I'm sure you've all used Wireshark before, right? Yes. Yes. So that's a protocol analyzer, so it's going to tell you everything you could ever possibly want to know about the traffic that goes on the network. And it's going to be able to tell you, you can drill down and look into the packet and see every little piece of it, and that can give you a lot of information, as I'm sure you know. So that's an example of a sniffing tool. The last thing I want to talk about is password analysis. We're going to talk more about passwords and hashing and stuff like that in a few chapters. And that will kind of make sense as to what we're going to do in the lab. You'll kind of be able to put that stuff together. So password analysis is just trying to recover a password or crack a password. So there's a few different types of password analysis. What I'm going to show you is a video, and I believe that he does a little bit of cracking.
To gain access to an account where you're authenticating, you need to provide your username and your password. The username is usually something that is easily seen, something you can see on the screen. It's often sent via plain text over the network, which means it's your password that is really the most important piece. It's something that is not sent in the clear over the network. It's often hashed, which means you have no way to reverse engineer what that original password happened to be. So the idea that the bad guys have is they'll try every possible scenario to try to determine what your password might be. This is called a brute force attack. They will very methodically go through every possible combination of lowercase letters, uppercase letters, numbers, and special characters to try to determine what your password happens to be. And if it sounds like this could be a very involved and very long process, then you would be correct. This takes a lot of time to be able to try every possible combination. If you've ever forgotten your own password to a corporate account or an online account, one of the things you'll notice is after a certain number of attempts, it locks the account completely, and at that point you have to receive an email or call somebody to unlock the account and reset the password. And that's to prevent these brute force attacks. The bad guys know that this process of over and over typing in a username and a password is not only slow, but as you can see, your account will quickly become locked out. That's why the bad guys gain access to the servers and gather the hashes directly from the authentication database itself. So they'll get a list of all the usernames and all of the hashes associated with those usernames. And the hashes are the hashed password that was sent into that system.
Okay, quickly, why would they go to the trouble of getting into the system and getting a list of all the hashes? What's the advantage of that over just a plain old brute force attack?
So, if you know the hash and you know the way it's hashed, you can return what the password is.
Okay, this is true.
Would you be able to only get the password from it?
You get the password from it. But why would they go to all the trouble to hack into someone's network to get that list?
The hash is pretty much like the parameters of what the password should be, so it wouldn't be as hard to crack the next password.
Okay, that's true. Once you figured out the hash, you would eventually, you would know how it's hashed, so you could be able to do that to every single person. One of the things that is important to note about it, if I'm trying to RDP or telnet into something and try a bunch of brute force attacks, it's going to lock me out after so many times. Most likely, if the setup is decent at all, right? If I get the password file, even if it's harder to do, if I get the password file and I put it on my computer, then I can just hack at my leisure, right? And I can just let a program run overnight and figure out everything for me. So that's just what I want y'all to know the difference between an online and an offline attack. An offline attack, you can hash in your pajamas at home while your computer does all the work.
And what they will do is begin their own calculations. Well, they'll take their random guess, they will hash it, and then they'll compare that hash to what was in the database. And they'll do this over and over and over. Because they have the hashes, they don't have to worry about locking down an account. They can keep trying this as much as they'd like. Brute forcing the hash has its own disadvantages, of course, because the bad guys have to physically calculate what that hash is, and that requires a number of CPU cycles. If you're simply typing in a username and password and trying to authenticate, there's not a lot of CPU cycles involved there. But if you're trying a million different calculations, you're trying a million different password iterations for a user, there's a number of CPU cycles that will be used there. So it's not a cakewalk for the bad guys. They still have to do some significant work to be able to compare their calculated hash with what the stored hash might be. Different applications and different operating systems will store this authentication hash in different ways. It's pretty standard across the application or across the operating system, but you can't take a hash from a Linux device and compare it to a hash from a Mac OS X or a Windows device, because those operating systems may store the hashes in different formats. This is an example of hashes that I grabbed from my Windows 7 device. So I've got these usernames, Jumper Bay, Carter, Jackson, O'Neill, and Tilt. Those are on my Windows 7 machine. There are some IDs associated with those usernames, and everything there at the end, that long string of hexadecimal numbers and letters there, that is the hash that is created by Windows 7. So if somebody grabbed this database, they could then take that information and begin their process of brute forcing those hashes. If you're trying to determine someone's password, you don't necessarily have to go through every possible iteration of lowercase numbers and uppercase numbers and letters and special characters. It might be a little faster if you simply chose words out of a dictionary. That tends to be what we use for passwords. It's something that we can remember. It's a word or a phrase that makes sense to us. So a dictionary is the perfect place to go. And we can even make it easier by starting with a list of passwords that are most commonly used. Words like password is one of the most common passwords and probably not a good idea to use for your authentication. There's other words like ninja and football that are just as familiar and just as commonly used. There are large databases on the internet you can download from many different places that have a list of the most popular passwords or a list of every word that happens to be in the dictionary, and the bad guys are going to use that list first before they go into randomizing and trying to determine what you might want to find from special characters or uppercase. For the smarter people, they're going to use those more complex passwords, but a dictionary attack is definitely going to grab the folks that are trying to use a simple password to remember which unfortunately is a very simple password for the bad guys to guess as well. Of course, not everybody uses a very common name as their password. Most people are going to add special characters or perhaps letters or numbers to replace other letters or numbers in a word. And one way that the bad guys can use to find these passwords is something called a hybrid attack, where they're going to use a very common set of dictionary words, but they're going to change them up just a little bit and try different variations of those words. So it's not uncommon to see somebody that might use the password apple, but they'll put the number 1 after the apple. Or they might use ninja and put the number 9. Or they might change a T to a 7 within those words. And the bad guys recognize that you're going to do this. So there are options in their brute forcing programs where they can use a dictionary, but change it and add numbers to the end. Replace the letter I with the number 1 to see if perhaps you're doing the same thing with your password. This is obviously going to take a little bit more time. You have to try one dictionary word and then many different iterations of that dictionary word. But obviously it's going to be a lot easier than going through every possible iteration of every character and every number and every special character as well. This is something the bad guys can easily configure inside of their password cracking or brute force software. So don't think that simply changing a number or changing a single letter is going to protect you, because the bad guys have already thought of that. There are a number of cryptographic theories the bad guys can use to help determine what your password might be or to be able to duplicate a hash. One of these is called the birthday attack. And the way that this works is best described by this. In a classroom of 23 students, what is the chance of 2 of those students sharing a birthday? Now, if you're thinking about this sort of offhand, you may think it's 1 in 365. But the example we're using here is every student is comparing their birthday to every other student. So the reality is, if you get 23 people in the room, there's about a 50% chance that one of those students is going to share a birthday. In the world of cryptography, this is called a hash collision. This is something that really should not be happening, but unfortunately a number of the hash algorithms that we use have the potential for colliding. A hash collision is when you have one type of plain text that creates a hash. You have a completely different plain text that creates the same hash as well. This isn't something that's supposed to happen. We design our hash algorithms so that we don't have these types of collisions, but unfortunately, these do exist with certain types of hashes. So this is a great thing to find for the bad guys, because they may not necessarily need your original text, and they might be able to use a different kind of text but still have exactly the same hash at the end of the day. This is something that the attackers will then use to create multiple versions of this plain text, especially if they can only slightly modify some plain text and then have exactly the same hash on the other side. They might be able to make changes to a document being sent across the network. On the other end, you can look at the digital signature of that hash and it matches what was sent, but the reality is that the bad guys changed something between one side and the other. And of course, this can be used for much more than just digital signatures. It could be used for the certificates that are used to encrypt data on a web server. So you might think you're going to a trusted web server, that the bad guys have changed and found a collision hash that allows them to build a certificate that looks like yours, that's really owned by the bad guys. One thing that can help prevent these hash collisions is to use very large hashes. The larger the hash, the more difficult it will be to find a collision, and the safer that plain text is going to be. We talked earlier about brute force attacks with hashes, where the bad guy would try to guess what your password was. They would calculate a hash and then compare that hash to what was stored. Well, what if all of the hashes, though, were already pre-calculated? And all of those hashes were not only pre-calculated, but also optimized to be able to store and find them very quickly. This type of database is called a rainbow table, and it's used quite often to try to reverse engineer those hashes. This could be a very, very fast way to determine what a password is, especially when you're dealing with larger and larger numbers of characters in a password, because those take a lot longer to go through and try every possible iteration. It's very easy to go through a set of 5-character passwords and try every possible combination. But what if it was a 12-character password? It takes a lot more time. Well, if you've already done the calculations and stored them in a rainbow table, now you can very, very quickly simply search through the table for exactly what you're looking for. Although having these rainbow tables can greatly speed up the process, you still need a separate table, separate database of these rainbow tables for each type of technology. That's because Windows 7 uses one way to hash, and MySQL might use a completely different way to hash these passwords. That means you need to build two completely separate sets of rainbow tables. So this hard work has to be done well before you go through the process of trying to reverse engineer. And if there are many different technologies that you need to reverse engineer, you'll need a separate rainbow table for each one of those. Since we recognize that bad guys can easily reverse engineer these hashes with a rainbow table, one thing that our application developers are doing is salting the passwords. They're adding our password and some random bit of information and storing that information on the server. That way, even if you are able to obtain my username and my salted hash, you would not be able to reverse engineer this with something like a rainbow table.
Okay, so he just spoke about a lot of the things that are the password analysis, the kinds of password analysis that we would use. So we can just guess. So most people are going to use a date that's significant to them, their dog's name, their child's name, their husband's name, wife's name. The dictionary attack, like you spoke about, is a prearranged list of things that might be likely. The brute force, where we just keep trying until we figure it out. Of course, it takes a really long time. The cryptanalysis attack, so we might use something in a rainbow table or something that's already been calculated, so the CPU is not calculating everything, it's just checking against a big list. So there's a few ways that we can do our password analysis. One of the popular softwares online, if you want to play with it, that's free, is called Cain Enable. The brothers in the Bible. So if you want to play with that at any time, that can be done for you. Okay, so let's go